The market at Vashran Station smelled like wet iron and something that might have been cinnamon if cinnamon had been grown in a swamp and left there to ferment for a decade. Petra Voss had been working a stall in the lower concourse for 11 months, and she still couldn't decide if the smell was offensive or just strange. It had become part of the texture of the place, like the way the grav plating hummed 2 octaves lower on the eastern side, or the way the keth vendors always arranged their goods in spirals you weren't supposed to touch. You stopped noticing, eventually. That was survival or something close to it. She had come to Vashran Station because the contract paid in Galactic Standard credits, and the cost of living in the lower concourse was low enough that she could send 40% back to her sister on Calloway's World. She had stayed because she was stubborn, and because the permit renewal was easier than the original application, and because after 11 months the wet iron air had become, in some uncomplicated way, home. She didn't examine this too closely. Home was a feeling, not a geography, and she'd stopped requiring the feeling to make sense. She was rearranging a display of stabilized nutrient capsules, human-compatible, flavored with something the V. Horan distributor called approximated citrus, when she heard it. A sound like a storm drain clearing, then another. Then a third, sustained, oscillating at a pitch that made the base of her teeth ache and sent a sympathetic vibration through the metal edge of her display shelf. Screaming, child screaming, even if the child doing it wasn't human. Petra looked up. 20 meters away, in the middle of the central walkway, a small alien was melting down. She'd seen V. Horan children before. They were common enough in the station's residential sectors, compact-bodied creatures with 6-jointed limbs and iridescent skin that shifted color with mood. Adults ran cool silver or deep blue. Children ran warm, amber, gold, a flickering pink-orange that made them look lit from within, as if something was burning pleasantly behind their skin. This one was running pure, saturated red, the color of a warning sign, of something about to break, and it was standing alone in the middle of a clearing crowd, shrieking at a frequency that sent every alien in a 20-meter radius backing away as if the air itself had turned hostile. No parent visible, no handler, no one moving toward it. The clearing was widening as Petra watched. She had never seen a crowd disperse like this, not panicked, not running, but deliberate, a steady, purposeful retreat of beings who knew what they were retreating from. The Keth merchant to her left had physically turned his back. The V. Horan couple 3 stalls down were pressed against each other, faces averted, the female's hand locked in the male's with a white-knuckled grip that Petra could read in any species. A pair of Dorak traders, beings roughly the size and shape of upright rhinoceroses, were moving away at a speed she'd never seen from their species. The Dorak didn't move fast for anything. They were doing it now. The child screamed again, longer this time. It had pressed itself against a support column, and its 6 limbs were clutching the air in a way that looked, stripped of all the alien context, exactly like a kid who had lost its parents in a crowd and was starting to understand what that meant. Petra set down the capsule she was holding. She looked left, looked right. Looked at the retreating backs of 30 beings who collectively outweighed her by roughly 4 tons, and appeared to be operating under the assumption that this was someone else's problem. "I'm going to do something stupid," she said, to no one in particular. The nearest Keth had its back turned. It didn't matter. She came out from behind her stall. The walkway cleared further as she approached, not because of her, but because the ripple of retreat was still moving outward, and she was walking against it, which made her the only thing in the corridor moving toward the screaming. She caught fragments of V. Horan in the ambient noise, words from people moving past her in the opposite direction. Her V. Horan was functional but not fluent enough for commerce, enough for directions, not enough for a crisis. She caught distress colors and uncontrolled frequency and something that might have been dangerous convergence. None of it resolved into a picture she could act on. The tone was what she could act on, and the tone said, "We know what this is, and we are leaving." She kept walking. The child saw her coming, and the screaming shifted pitch, still anguished, but with a new note in it. Uncertain. The shrieking had the quality of a signal suddenly receiving interference. Petra dropped to one knee when she was 3 meters out, bringing herself level with the child's eyeline. The Vhorin had 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal band across their upper face, and all 4 of the child's were fixed on her. They were amber gold with slitted pupils, but larger in proportion, the way all children's eyes were large, designed by evolution to make care feel natural. The child's color was fractured red throughout. Not uniform, there were darker patches, almost brown, where the stress seemed concentrated. "Hey," Petra said quietly. The word was meaningless to the child, but tone traveled. It always traveled. "Hey, I see you, it's okay." The child's color flickered, red to red, amber to red, like a pilot light trying to catch and failing. Petra sat down on the walkway. Full cross-legged, the way she'd sat in her grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings waiting for bread to come out of the oven, the yellow linoleum warm under her legs and the whole house smelling of yeast and flour. She put her hands flat on her own knees, palms up, open. No approach, no reaching, just presence, just a body that had decided to be here instead of somewhere else. She started humming. It was an old song, nothing with a name, something her grandmother had sung while kneading dough, a melody without a known origin, just something that had moved through generations until it reached Petra and stopped there for lack of anyone to pass it to. A 4-bar thing, looping. She hummed it now because it was the only thing she could think of that was slow and low, and didn't involve using words she didn't know in a situation she didn't understand. Because the situation was beyond her vocabulary in more than one language, and the only honest response to that was to stop trying to manage it and just stay. The child's screaming stuttered. Not stopped, not resolved, just interrupted, the way a crying child sometimes pauses mid-sob to look at something unexpected, buying itself a moment of confusion before deciding whether to resume. The ambient noise of the market continued around them. Somewhere behind her, Petra could hear the low rumble of a commotion building, voices, movement, the sound of many people converging at pace. She ignored it and kept humming. The child's color shifted, red to deep amber, still not silver, still not calm, but the edge had come off and the sustained shrieking had dropped to something irregular, broken. A child still crying, but crying differently, working through it now rather than cresting it. Petra held out one hand, not toward the child, just open beside her knee, resting on the floor. An offer, not a demand. No direct eye contact. She looked at a point just past the child's left shoulder, the same way you didn't look directly at a cat you wanted to come to you. The child looked at her hand for a long moment, then it looked at her face. Then it looked at her hand again. Then it took 3 careful steps forward on its 6 articulated limbs, each step deliberate, the gait of something testing ground that might not hold, and pressed its small, warm, iridescent face against Petra's shoulder. She wrapped an arm around it, the way you hold any crying child, firm enough to feel solid, loose enough to allow escape. The child's skin was warm where it touched her and smooth, and it pulsed faintly with a light she could feel more than see, a bioluminescent rhythm like a very slow heartbeat, steady even when the color remained distressed. The child's whole body was tense, drawn in on itself. But it was here. It had chosen to be here. Petra kept humming. The child's color continued to shift, amber gold. Something close to silver gold. The complicated hue of late afternoon light coming through water. The commotion behind her had stopped. Not gradually, suddenly. The way a room goes quiet when something unexpected happens. Petra heard, very clearly in the new silence, someone say something in Vhorin that she didn't have the vocabulary for. But the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of a person who has just witnessed something they cannot explain and isn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. She looked up slowly. The central walkway was full, not the ordinary traffic of the lower concourse, something else entirely. Uniformed figures, at least 40 of them, arranged in 2 concentric arcs behind and to either side of her, all facing her. The uniforms were dark, with a silver thread pattern at the collar that she'd never seen before, not station security, not commercial inspectors, something older and more precise. Their expressions, the ones whose faces she could read, ranged from rigid control to barely suppressed panic. Standing at the center of the inner arc was an alien she recognized immediately. She'd seen his face on every official display panel in Vashran Station for the past 8 months. The panels rotated between a system map, a tariff schedule, and his portrait, formal, composed, eyes forward, skinned the deep controlled silver of Vhoran authority. The portrait conveyed distance. The being in front of her conveyed something more complicated. Varith Khan, Imperial Governor of the Vhoran Outer Systems. He was staring at the child in her arms. His color, the deep, controlled silver she knew from the display panels, had fractured at the edges. Something copper-tinted was bleeding through at his jaw, at his temples, like a crack in lacquer revealing a different material beneath. She had been told, in one of the station orientation sessions 11 months ago, that Vhoran in positions of authority maintained constant physiological control of their color expression as a matter of professional discipline. The instructor had mentioned it without emphasis, as a fact of cross-species commerce. He had not said what it looked like when that control failed. She knew now. "You should know," said a voice in accented but fluent galactic standard, somewhere to her left, "that you are currently holding the crown heir of the Vhoran Imperium." Petra looked toward the voice. A Vhoran in a different uniform, gray, with more complex silver threading, the kind of uniform that said administrative rather than military, was standing 4 meters away. He had the controlled expression of a person delivering terrible news in a professional register, the particular composure of someone who had decided that if he showed exactly how alarmed he was, the situation would deteriorate. "The heir," the Vhoran continued, "has not permitted physical contact from any being in approximately 3 standard years. The last individual who attempted contact was a trained attachment specialist with 14 years of experience working with high convergence cases." A pause. "She required medical intervention for 12 days. Petra looked at the child. The child's small limbs had wrapped loosely around her ribs, 6 small points of contact, each one deliberate. "Okay," Petra said. "You appear remarkably calm," the gray-uniformed Vhoran said. "I'm extremely not calm," Petra said. "I just don't think this is the moment to demonstrate that." The child made a sound against her shoulder. It was low and rhythmic, and after a moment Petra realized with a small lurch in her chest that it was mimicking her, humming back. Imprecisely, with the uncertain pitch of a child learning a melody it had never heard, the intervals slightly off, the rhythm slightly unsteady, but deliberately, back and forth between them like a conversation in a language they'd invented in the last 3 minutes. The Imperial Governor made a sound, short and involuntary, barely controlled. The effect on the assembled guards was immediate. Every uniformed figure shifted posture simultaneously, a biological reverence response, and the gray-uniformed translator took a half-step back as if he'd heard something not intended for him. "He wishes to know," the translator said after a moment, "how you accomplished this." Petra considered the question seriously. "I sat down," she said. The translator's secondary eyelids, the horizontal inner membrane, blinked. "That is the entirety of your answer." "I sat down and I kept my hands where the kid could see them and I hummed something old." She paused. "I didn't accomplish anything. The child made its own choices. I just gave it something to choose toward." The governor spoke again, longer this time. The translator listened with the focused attention of a person listening for what was writing underneath the words. Then he turned back to Petra. The heir has been in what our physicians call a convergent state for 6 days, the translator said. It is a condition in which the older genetic inheritance of the imperial line asserts itself, a trait bred into the lineage in the 3rd century of the Compact, before the imperial families fully understood what they were selecting for. Historically, the translator hesitated, choosing words with visible care. Historically, convergence in an untrained heir has caused significant casualties. In the heir's great-grandmother's time, a convergence event destroyed a vessel carrying 300 individuals. The great-grandmother was 7 years old. She was not aware of what she was doing. Petra did not look at the ring of guards. She did not look at the governor's fractured color. She looked at the child, who was still warm and still humming, and whose color had settled into something she couldn't precisely name but that felt, to the part of her that had held crying children before, like the beginning of calm. "How long has the heir been alone?" she asked. The translator paused. "Since the onset of convergence. Protocol requires isolation of an untrained heir during the convergence period to prevent uncontrolled." "That's not what I asked." Petra kept her voice level. "How long has the heir been alone?" Another pause. The governor spoke quietly. The translator turned away for a moment, then turned back. 6 days, the translator said. Petra let out a breath that was not quite a word and not quite an oath. Something short and involuntary. She shifted the child slightly in her arms and resumed humming, not out of strategy, just because it was the thing she was doing, and stopping seemed worse than continuing. "You will need to transfer the heir to the medical team," the translator said. "The convergent state requires." "I will transfer this child," Petra said, "when the child indicates it's ready, not before." The silence that followed was the particular silence of many people deciding simultaneously not to say anything. 40 uniformed beings and an imperial governor, and not one of them spoke. The governor's copper-tinted color had deepened. He was watching her with an expression she was starting to be able to read, and what she read in it was not anger. It was something more complicated. Something that looked, in the unfamiliar register of V-Horan emotion, like a man watching something he had failed to do being done by someone who hadn't been trying to do anything at all. They stayed that way for 20 minutes. Petra's knees started to ache against the concourse floor. She breathed through it. The child's humming grew steadier. Its color moved increment by increment toward pure silver gold, not the silver of authority, nothing like the cool professional tone of adult V-Horan, but a different thing, richer, more layered, the color of something that had burned hot and was cooling into something settled. The translator, at one point, made a sound so quiet that Petra almost missed it, and when she glanced over she saw the composed expression had finally cracked. The V-Horan had his secondary eyelids pressed closed. She looked back at the child. "Hey," she said quietly, "you okay?" The child lifted its face from her shoulder. All 4 eyes looked at her. At close range the iridescence of its skin was extraordinary, not a color but a quality, like light through a soap bubble, endlessly shifting without ever resolving into a single hue. The child's face was small and precise, the features finer than an adult V-Horan's, the jaw less pronounced. It was looking at her with the focused attention of a being that had just been through something enormous and was now assessing whether the world was safe. It reached up one small limb and touched her face. The contact was precise, 3 delicate points against her cheekbone, deliberate, not exploratory. As if it was testing whether she was real, whether she would flinch. She didn't flinch. The child said, not a word, her note. The first note of the melody held for a moment clear and questioning. Petra hummed the rest of it back. The governor made a sound, soft, short, possibly something he hadn't intended to make in front of 40 members of his personal guard. Nobody acknowledged it. "The governor wishes to know your name and designation," the translator said, returning to protocol because protocol was what he had. "Petra Voss, Station Permit Class 4, Lower Concourse, Stall 19. I sell nutritional supplements." She paused. "And my grandmother's recipe for something approximating soup if anyone's having a difficult week." The translator repeated this in Vhoran. The governor listened, said something. "He wishes to know," the translator said, "what you want." Petra thought about this seriously, not the question she'd expected. The kid needs somewhere warm, somewhere that doesn't feel like isolation protocol. She looked at the ring of guards. "And whatever convergence means for your species, I'd be willing to bet it's not helped by 6 days of nobody touching you." The governor was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "He says," the translator said, "that you have told him nothing his own physicians did not tell him 3 days ago." "Then maybe you should have listened to your physicians." Another silence. Then, and Petra watched this happen across the governor's face with the slow surprise of seeing something you'd been told was impossible occurring in front of you. The imperial governor of the Vhoran outer systems made a sound she eventually recognized as laughter. Short, controlled, almost immediately suppressed, but real. He spoke again. The translator said, "He asks if you would be willing to accompany the heir to the medical facility." The translator searched as a transitional presence until the heir is stable. Petra looked down at the child. The child looked back at her. "Yeah," Petra said, "of course." The medical facility on the upper decks was a different world from the lower concourse. Everything here was clean and white and calibrated to a temperature that felt slightly too cool. The air filtered to a sterile neutral that carried no information, not the swamp iron cinnamon of the market, not anything recognizable. The child's grip tightened briefly as they crossed into it, and Petra adjusted her hold and started humming again without thinking about it. The lead physician met them at the intake corridor. She was an older Vhoran female with the silver-white coloring that age produced in their species. Iridescence still present but deepened and slowed, like sunlight through old glass. She looked at Petra with an expression Petra couldn't initially read, and then the Vhoran bowed her head, not the head duck of formal commercial interaction, but something slower and more deliberate, containing information Petra wasn't sure she was supposed to receive. "I am Physician Sova," the Vhoran said, in careful standard. "I have been the heir's physician since birth. I have also been the individual most consistently arguing against the isolation protocols since their implementation 6 days ago, with," she paused, "very limited success." Her gaze settled on the child, who was still pressed against Petra's shoulder, and something in the physician's expression did what expressions do when relief arrives too late and too slowly. "I will not pretend that what you have accomplished today is something I do not understand. I understand it. I simply could not replicate it. I could not get close enough to try." "You're not a grandmother," Petra said. The physician's secondary eyelids blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Grandmothers learn to sit in the chaos instead of trying to stop it," Petra said. "My grandmother sat down in my mother's worst moments and didn't say anything and didn't leave. You just waited out with them. The kids get tired eventually. They just need to know someone's staying." Physician Sova looked at her for a long time. "Come with me," she said. "I have a room that is warmer." The room she led them to was different from the intake corridor, lower light, higher temperature, the surfaces rounded rather than angular. It looked like someone had made a deliberate effort to reduce the clinical atmosphere and succeeded partially. There was a low platform that served as a sleeping surface, and several objects whose function Petra didn't know arranged at the edges of the room. The child let go of Petra gradually, the way children do when they've decided to trust a space but want the decision to be theirs. First it leaned back and looked around, all 4 eyes moving in that horizontal band scan. Then it climbed down and onto the platform the physician indicated. Then it turned and looked back at Petra. "I'll be right here," Petra said. "I'm not going anywhere." The child sat down. Its color had settled. Silver gold, steady, the iridescence slow and deep rather than rapid and fractured. Physician Sova was monitoring something on a panel that Petra couldn't read, but the posture of every V-Horin in the room had changed in a way she could read, a kind of distributed relief, the loosening of held breath, bodies returning to their natural state after long tension. "The frequency indicators are normalizing," the physician said, quietly, more to herself than to Petra, 3 days ahead of any previous model's projection. A pause. 6 days ahead of the most pessimistic model. "What was the most pessimistic model projecting?" Petra asked. The physician was quiet for a moment. "That we would need to consider more drastic interventions." Petra didn't ask what that meant. The tone told her enough. The door opened. The governor entered. Without his retinue, he was a different presence, still imposing, still carrying the quality of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his arrival. But something had shifted. The copper at his jaw and temples was still present but not advancing. He looked, Petra thought, like a person who had been trying very hard to hold something together and had not quite succeeded, and was beginning to understand that the not quite succeeding was the problem. He crossed to the child without looking at anyone else in the room, stood at the edge of the platform. The child looked up at him. Then, and Petra watched this carefully, understanding she was watching something not designed to be witnessed, the heir reached up and touched the governor's face. Same gesture, 3 precise points, the same deliberateness the child had used with her, a test, or a greeting, or a confirmation. The governor's silver fractured completely. What bled through wasn't copper this time. It was gold. Deep, unsuppressed, uncontrolled, the color of something that had been locked behind silver for 6 days and was now out, and the governor was not trying to contain it. He sat beside his child on the platform and put one hand over the child's extended limb. The child made a sound that Petra eventually understood was the V-Horin equivalent of a sigh. The translator appeared at Petra's elbow, quieter than she expected. "He is not ordinarily demonstrative," the translator said, almost to himself. "I know," Petra said. "You cannot know that. You met him 40 minutes ago." "I know what it looks like when someone's been trying to hold everything together in front of everyone else for 6 days straight and just got permission to stop," Petra said. "That's not a V-Horin thing. That's just a person thing." The translator looked at her sideways. His expression was the complex one she was coming to think of as the face V-Horin made when humans said something that was either completely obvious or completely incomprehensible, and they couldn't determine which. "I will tell you something," the translator said. "I have served the governor for 14 years. I have been in this station for 11 of them. I have observed humans in that time with considerable attention, because a significant portion of my role involves managing human V-Horin commercial interactions and the misunderstandings that arise from them. I understand, I think, approximately 70% of your behavioral patterns." He paused. "You are consistently in the remaining 30. "What's the 30%? "The part," the translator said, "that sits down in the middle of things." She stayed 3 days. This had not been her intention. Her intention had been to accompany the child to medical, see the child settled, and return to stall 19 to count the nutrient capsules she'd failed to sell. But the child, the heir, whose name she was eventually given as Vashan Kale, though the child clearly and immediately preferred Kale in Petra's accent, which rendered the first syllable short, and the second with a slightly rising tone that apparently approximated the V-Horin diminutive, was not interested in being settled without her present. Physician Sova, who had been arguing against the isolation protocols for 6 days with limited success, felt that stability took precedence over concourse commerce. The governor had said something that the translator rendered as, "Your stall will be looked after," which it was, with an efficiency that suggested imperial administrative authority could be turned toward things other than governance when properly motivated. Someone had not only monitored the stall, but sold 17 additional packages of approximated citrus nutrient capsules to customers drawn by curiosity about the commotion who stayed for the product. Petra slept in a room adjacent to Kale's medical suite. She ate food that physician Sova kept trying to improve based on Petra's explanations of human nutritional requirements, a well-meaning process that produced meals that were technically adequate and texturally distressing in ways difficult to articulate. On the second morning, she requested basic ingredients for soup and made it in the facility's prep area, while physician Sova watched with the focused attention of a researcher unexpectedly encountering primary data. Kale sat on the counter and watched too. The smell of the soup, approximated vegetables in human-compatible broth, black pepper and dried herbs from the station's small human goods import shelf. The closest Petra could come to what her grandmother had made on cold evenings in a house with yellow linoleum floors. Filled the prep area and drifted into the corridor, and did something to the atmosphere of the entire section that Petra didn't notice, until one of the younger medical staff paused in the doorway, with an expression she recognized from the inside as the particular homesickness that hits you sideways, from a smell rather than a thought. She made a larger batch. Over the 3 days, she learned the shape of Kale's world. The heir was 8 years old in Vhoran reckoning, which corresponded loosely to 6 in human developmental terms, old enough for complex language, for intentionality, for the particular stubbornness of a child who has decided something and is not going to be moved. Kale was curious about everything: the facility's monitoring panels, the texture of the floor, the exact sound that Petra's boots made on different surfaces, the differences between Petra's hands and Vhoran limb tips. Kale was also, Petra learned gradually, extraordinarily perceptive, tracking changes in ambient sound, temperature, and the color expressions of every Vhoran in the room simultaneously, adjusting behavior accordingly, doing all of this without appearing to pay attention to any of it. On the first evening, Kale had asked Petra, through a combination of gesture and the few standard words the heir had apparently been accumulating in secret, about the song. Petra had tried to explain that she didn't know where it came from, which Kale had found unsatisfying. The heir had the expression of a child who believes that all things have origins, and that the adult is simply not trying hard enough to remember the right one. Old, Petra had said. Very old, grandmother, her grandmother before that. Kale had processed this with the focused silence the heir used for things requiring real consideration. Then it had hummed the melody again, precisely, with the intent of someone committing it to permanent storage. Mine now too, Kale had asked. The standard was careful, the phrasing consciously built. Yeah, Petra had said, yours too. Kale's color had gone solid gold, not the silver gold of calm or the fractured gold of uncontrolled emotion, but something cleaner than either. Satisfaction, Petra decided. Deep, uncomplicated satisfaction, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. She'd gone to sleep that first night in the adjacent room thinking about her grandmother's kitchen and the yellow linoleum, and the way bread smelled when it was almost done, and you were still waiting. About things that got passed down without names, without history, without anyone deciding they were important. They just moved from hand to hand because someone held on. Physician Sova had found her in the corridor the second morning with an expression Petra was coming to read as the physician's version of agitation, a slight quickening of the iridescence, a tension in the secondary eyelids. The heir, the physician said, has been asking the night staff to practice the melody. Is that a problem? The night staff, physician Sova said, are not musically gifted, but they are trying very hard because the heir is asking, and the heir's color stays stable while they try, and everyone in this facility is currently extremely motivated to keep the air's color stable. A pause. I thought you should know, in case you encountered an unusual number of Vhorin attempting to hum in corridors today. Petra had, in fact, encountered 3 of them on her way to breakfast. She hadn't said anything. It had seemed like the right call. Smart kid, Petra said to physician Sova on the second afternoon. Yes, the physician said. The convergence trait and the perceptive trait are linked in the imperial line's genetics. The trait that creates the risk also creates something exceptional. She paused, and Petra heard in the pause everything the physician hadn't been able to say for 6 days. I have been Kale's physician since birth. I have never believed isolation was the correct response to convergence. But the protocols are very old. What do the protocols say the purpose of isolation is? Containment, the physician said, to prevent the convergent state from affecting others. And what does isolation actually do? Physician Sova looked at her steadily. Amplifies it. The convergent state in the imperial line is triggered by acute relational distress. Isolation does not reduce relational distress. It intensifies it. The protocol was written in the 3rd century of the Compact, when the understanding of the convergence mechanism was significantly less sophisticated than it is now. A pause. I have submitted 4 papers in the past 3 years arguing for revision. And they were acknowledged, the physician said. The words sat in the air for a moment with all the weight of a thing that means nothing, and everyone knows it means nothing. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, the translator came to find Petra with the expression of someone who had been sent. The governor wishes to speak with you, the translator said. The governor's office adjacent to the medical suite was not what she'd expected. Not imposing, functional, worn, the kind of space that had been lived in rather than maintained for appearances. The desk was covered with display panels she couldn't read. The chair looked like it had been sat in too hard and too often over too short a period. A secondary chair had been placed at the side of the desk with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about where to put it. The governor stood when she entered. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure if it was Vhorin custom or personal choice. He gestured toward the second chair and waited for her to sit before sitting himself. His color was controlled again, but it felt different now, less like suppression, more like preference, as if the gold had been acknowledged and set aside rather than buried. He wishes to discuss, the translator said, taking a position by the door, the matter of what you are owed. I'm not owed anything, Petra said. The translator paused. That is. I mean it, Petra said. I sat on a floor and hummed something my grandmother taught me. That's not a service. That's just what happened. The translator and the governor exchanged a look. The kind of look that contained a complete exchange of information between people who had worked together long enough to have a private language of expression. He wishes to offer, the translator said carefully, the following. Station elevation, your permit class upgraded to commercial class 2 with access to the upper concourse. Commercial licensing with 5-year protection against concourse reallocation. Relocation arrangements if preferred. Travel accommodations to any system within Vhorin jurisdiction. He paused. These are the categories his advisors have prepared. He says they are a starting point. Petra looked at the governor. The governor looked back at her. None of that, she said. Thank you, but none of it. Silence. He wishes to understand, the translator said. Why not? Because you can't compensate me for something that wasn't a transaction. She thought about how to say it. My grandmother would have done the same thing. In the market, it wouldn't have occurred to her not to. You can't pay someone for their grandmother's reflexes. The governor spoke. The translator said, he asks what you would have done if the convergence had escalated, if the air's distressed state had become dangerous. Petra thought about this honestly. Probably the same thing, she said. Maybe faster, I don't know. I've never been in that situation. You were in that situation, the translator said. Not the version you're describing. The version I was in had a miserable 8-year-old who needed someone to stay. She paused. Those feel different from the inside. The translator translated. The governor was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke something sustained, chosen carefully even as he said it. He says, the translator said, that human behavior has been studied by Heir researchers for 3 generations. The consistent conclusion is that humans are difficult to model because your decision-making operates on a variable that does not appear in standard frameworks. Researchers have named this variable differently: irrational altruism, instinct override, chaos compassion, coalition extension reflex. The translator paused. He says he has read these papers. He has found them unsatisfying. Petra waited. He says he believes the research is missing the point. He believes humans do not calculate risk the same way. Not because you lack the capacity, clearly you were aware of the risk in that walkway, but because you carry, very close to the surface, some older response. Some original instruction that says, there is a small creature in distress and I am here, and that is all the calculation required. A pause. He says the Heir had this response once. It is present in the historical record. Medical texts from before the formalization of the compact describe something they call primary bonding reflex, a convergence of care behaviors across individuals regardless of relational category. He says the records suggest it was trained out of the formal classes over 3 generations. Specifically trained out, there were reasons that seemed sufficient at the time. The translator's voice remained professional, but something underneath it had changed. He is not certain the reasons were sufficient. The governor spoke again without waiting for Petra's response. The translator listened, then continued. He says, I want to tell you what I was thinking, standing in that walkway. I was calculating. I was running the risk assessments I have been trained to run since I was young: threat level, probable radius of effect, secondary casualty projections, the institutional liability of a governing officer taking unprotected exposure during a confirmed convergence event. I ran all of these calculations very efficiently while my child screamed. The translator's voice had gone very careful. He says, and then you walked out of a nutrient supplement stall and sat on the floor, and the calculations became irrelevant. He says he has been thinking about the gap between those 2 things for 3 days. He says he does not yet know what to do with it, but he intends to keep thinking about it for a long time. Petra looked at the governor. The governor met her gaze in the way of someone who had decided, for once, not to manage the moment. Tell him, Petra said, that the calculations weren't wrong. The risk was real and he knew it was real, and a person who didn't know the risk sat down anyway. That's not a failure of his judgment. That's the difference between knowing something and not knowing it. She paused. The useful thing isn't to feel bad about the calculation. The useful thing is to ask whether the calculation is the right tool for all situations. The translator translated. The governor was still for a long moment. Then the gold moved back through his silver, slow, deliberate, not fracturing but threading, the 2 colors finding a way to coexist in the same register. He said something brief. He says, the translator said quietly, that is the most useful thing anyone has said to him in 14 years of governance. Then he's been talking to the wrong people, Petra said. The translator blinked, then said with precision, he says that is also the most useful thing anyone has said to him in 14 years of governance. Petra was quiet for a moment. What's the quote on the display panels? She asked. The one in Heir, everywhere in the station. I've seen it for 8 months and my Heir isn't good enough. The translator blinked. The station attribution. It reads, there is no force in the universe more dangerous than a mind that has lost its original nature, attributed to the founder of the second Heir compact. Okay, Petra said. I heard a different version somewhere. Old human writer, 16th century Earth. He wrote, there is no monster in the world so treacherous as man. She let that sit. I think those are the same observation from opposite directions. One version is a warning about what you lose. The other version is a warning about what you become when you've lost it. The translator translated slowly, carefully. The governor sat very still. His color was doing something Petra hadn't seen before, the silver and the gold not warring against each other but moving together, a slow alternation that looked less like failed control and more like integration. He said something brief and quiet. He says, the translator said, that he would like to understand humans better. He says he would like to begin with you if you are willing. He says, a pause. He says he recognizes this is a significant thing to ask of someone who came to his station to sell nutrient supplements. Petra laughed. It came out surprised. The translator's secondary eyelids blinked. I've got a business to run, she said. He says that can be accommodated. Kale found her on the morning of the third day. The heir had graduated from medical confinement to supervised freedom within the facility, which in practice meant Kale was followed at a respectful distance by two guards who had learned, Petra suspected through experience, not to reach suddenly for anything, not to make rapid movements in the heir's peripheral vision, and not to attempt to redirect Kale's attention through anything other than patient waiting. Kale moved through the corridors with the focused energy of a child who had been confined too long and was now investigating everything within reach with systematic thoroughness. Petra was in the prep area. Not cooking, just sitting at the small counter with a cup of something approximating coffee, in the quiet before the day shift started. She heard the soft sound of six-legged V-horn movement before she saw Kale in the doorway. The heir stood there for a moment, looking at her. "Morning," Petra said. Kale crossed the room and climbed onto the counter beside her. Arranged its 6 limbs in the compact sitting posture she'd seen it use when it felt comfortable and didn't need to be ready to move. After a moment, the heir began humming, the melody, slightly more accurate now than it had been 3 days ago in the walkway, some of the intervals coming in closer to right. A child learning a song the way children did, by repetition and stubbornness, without concern for technique, in the exact order that felt natural regardless of whether that order was the correct order. Petra hummed along. They sat like that for a while in the quiet of the early facility. 2 beings from species that had been circling each other with caution and research programs and formal protocols for 3 generations, sharing a melody that neither of them could have named and both of them knew. The translator appeared in the doorway at some point. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, his version of witnessing. "What is that melody?" he asked finally. "I don't know," Petra said. "Something old. Something passed down. Does it have words? If it does, I've never known them." The translator was quiet. Kale continued to hum, uninterrupted. "The governor has asked me to tell you," the translator said, "that whatever arrangement you are willing to accept, the Imperium is prepared to offer. He said to tell you that this is not a transaction. He said," the translator worked through the translation with unusual care, "he said to tell you that he is attempting, for the first time in 14 years of office, to describe something accurately rather than formally." "What did he say?" "He said, I have governed these systems for 14 years. I have studied human presence in them with great care because I was told your species was unpredictable and therefore a risk to stable administration." He said, "I believe I had this exactly backward." He said, "You are unpredictable in the way that water is unpredictable. You find the openings we do not think to close because it does not occur to us that anything would want to pass through them. We build our systems around managing risk. You build yours around responding to what is in front of you. These are not the same thing, and I have spent 14 years mistaking one for the other." The translator paused. He also said this part is his own addition, outside the formal statement, he said. "I stood in that walkway for 11 minutes before you arrived. I could not go to my child. I understood the risk parameters. I could not override them. He said he does not know what to do with that understanding except to carry it. Petra was quiet for a moment. He knows what to do with it, she said. He's already doing it. The protocol revision. And the consultations, and asking instead of just deciding. She looked at the translator. He's doing it. He just hasn't noticed yet that he started. The translator was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are in the 30% again." "I know," Petra said. "I live here." Kale reached over and took Petra's hand. Small points of contact, 3 delicate limb tips wrapped around 2 of her fingers, the grip light but deliberate. The air's color was steady gold-silver, deep and even, the slow bioluminescent pulse of something that had been through something enormous and come out the other side of it. "The kid's going to be okay," Petra said. "The physician believes so," the translator said. "With significantly revised protocols and earlier intervention methodology going forward, the governor has already issued the instruction. The protocols are being rewritten." He paused. He used the word barbaric in the administrative order. That word does not appear in imperial gubernatorial documents as a rule. "Good," Petra said. Physician Sova also wishes to ask something. She wishes to know if you would review her papers on the convergence protocol revision. She says your practical framework would be useful to her theoretical argument. The translator's expression shifted slightly. She said that you understand something her papers have been trying to say for 3 years, and that having you read them might help her find the words. Petra was a permit Class 4 vendor of nutrient supplements with a secondary product line of approximated soup. She had no academic credentials in Heir developmental psychology or anything adjacent to it. "Sure," she said, "no promises, but I'll read them." On the morning of her 3rd day, she walked back to the lower concourse. She said goodbye to Kale in the manner that Kale had determined was appropriate. The air pressed its 3 limb tips against her cheek one more time, and Petra put her hand briefly over them, and they held that for a moment before the air released her. The air's color was steady. That was the important thing. The color was steady. Physician Sova walked her to the facility's exit corridor and stopped at the boundary of her territory the way physicians do. Not going further because this was someone else's world now, but not leaving either. "The papers," the physician said. "I'll read them." "I want you to know," Physician Sova said carefully, "that what you did in the walkway, I have thought about it carefully, and I believe the correct medical term for what you did is obvious. It was obvious. The correct intervention was obvious, and we had all the information we needed to attempt it, and we did not attempt it because the protocols said not to, and because the risk models said not to, and because 14 people with advanced training looked at the situation and calculated themselves into paralysis." The physician's secondary eyelids pressed closed briefly. "You did not calculate yourself into paralysis." "I didn't know enough to be paralyzed," Petra said. "Yes," Physician Sova said, "that is precisely what I mean." Petra thought about that for the rest of the walk down to the lower concourse. The facility's clean, neutral air gave way at some point to the wet iron cinnamon atmosphere of the market, and Petra breathed it in the way you breathe familiar air, not noticing it as a smell, just noticing the feeling of arrival that came with it. The grav plating was doing its low eastern hum. The Keth vendors were setting up their spirals. The ordinary machinery of station life was running its ordinary course, indifferent to imperial airs and convergent states, and 3 days that had changed something in the upper decks in ways she suspected were still working themselves out. Her stall was exactly as she'd left it 3 days ago, except that someone had restocked and reorganized the display in a way that was technically correct and completely lacked her personal logic. She spent 20 minutes putting it back the way it belonged. The Vhorin couple who came every 3rd day stopped in front of her stall. They looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then the female said something quiet in Vhoran that her vocabulary wasn't quite up to. "Sorry," Petra said, "my Vhoran isn't." "We saw," the male said in careful standard, stiff, unpracticed but clear, 3 days ago in the walkway. Petra waited. "We moved away," the female said, "all of us. We understood what we were moving away from. The risk was real." A pause. "But we moved away from a child." "It's okay," Petra said. "It is not, I think," the female said. "We keep saying this to each other, that it is not okay. We do not have good words for what we are feeling about it. Our language has many words for assessed risk and correct protocol response. It has fewer words for what we feel when the protocol was correct, and we still feel we did something wrong." Petra thought about that. "You followed a rule that told you something dangerous was happening and you needed to stay back," she said. "That rule exists because real things have gone wrong before. You weren't wrong to follow it." She paused. "I didn't know the rule, I just saw a kid." "Yes," the male said. "That is exactly the part we keep talking about." The female was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In our language there is a word that comes from the early period, before the compact. We do not use it much in the outer systems. It is a word from before the formal protocols." "What does it mean?" Petra asked. The female looked at her husband. They exchanged something, not words, just color, private and quick, a conversation in a register Petra couldn't follow. "It means," the female said, "staying in the storm with someone, not fixing the storm, not assessing the storm, not having a protocol for the storm, staying in it because someone is in it." A pause. "We have been saying it to each other since 3 days ago. We think we had forgotten what it meant." Petra was quiet for a moment. "That's a good word," she said. "Is there a version of it that means learning it again?" The male blinked his secondary eyelids. "We are not certain. We would have to think about it." "Think about it," Petra said. "And come back and tell me." They bought 4 packages of approximated citrus and left, and Petra watched them go, and thought about words that had been forgotten and were being found again. Sometime around midday, a message arrived on her station account. The translator's name was on the sender line, but it had been routed through the governor's formal office. The message said, "The governor requests a standing consultation, twice per decade, beginning at your convenience. Initial sessions will focus on human frameworks for early developmental support and convergence response methodology. Subsequent sessions open to whatever topics seem useful. Compensation to be negotiated at the first meeting." Below that, in a clearly different register, the translation slightly less certain, the syntax less formal, the phrasing more careful in the way that suggested it had been added separately and checked several times. The message continued. "The heir asked if you would also come. This is not a condition of the consultation. It is a request from Kale. The heir has been practicing the melody. The intervals are improving." Petra read the message twice. She thought about the physician's papers on the data chip in her pocket. She thought about the word that meant staying in the storm. She thought about Kale on the counter in the prep area, humming a song with no name, learning it in the order that felt natural regardless of whether that order was technically correct. She sent back yes to both. "Tuesday works. Fair warning, I make soup on Tuesdays and I'll probably bring some. It won't taste like anything from your food system. That's the point." The response came in 11 minutes. He says that is exactly the point. He also says, "Thank you." He says the translator will tell you that this is not a formal expression. He says it is the other kind. Petra set her data device down on the display shelf beside the approximated citrus capsules. She looked out at the lower concourse, the vendors and buyers, and the complicated daily negotiations of species learning to occupy the same space, to breathe the same weird air, to build something that worked in the gaps between what they each understood and what they each didn't. She started humming, quietly, not thinking about it. The melody went through once, and then again the 4-bar loop, patient and unhurried. From somewhere behind her, not close, not immediate, but present and deliberate, she heard a small sound. The beginning of the same melody, off by half a note on the third interval. Getting better. Kale's guards were going to have opinions about the air being in the lower concourse unsupervised. She would deal with that when she had to. She kept humming. The station turned. The market went on. The old melody moved between them across 20 meters of alien market air, finding its way through all the strange smells and the off-key grav plating and the spirals you weren't supposed to touch, patient as water, patient as something that has always known it will eventually get through. There is no monster in the world so treacherous as man, the old writer had said. But he'd been writing from the inside of something, from the middle of the storm, trying to warn about it. He hadn't known that the same creature capable of every darkness he described was also capable of sitting down on a cold floor in an alien market and humming something its grandmother taught it to a screaming child it had never met. Both things were true. That was the whole story. Petra hummed the melody through one more time and got back to work.